philosophy of math, like just with any kind of philosophy, like it brings in all sorts of other things that like you need like all these foundational tools that I call them philosophical devices in order to get at the problem, and that's what the author Øystein, I know how to pronounce it. He's a Norwegian, Linnebo. Linnebo. So that's how it's pronounced, I believe. But anyways, one thing about philosophers is that in most of their texts they have no problem giving their own view, and that's pretty appropriate, even though there's no really established facts in philosophy. So I wanted to highlight that feature. Now, there are a lot of people, a lot of philosophers of mathematics and logic that disagree with this guy, right? I mean, there's disagreement all around, and it's very common. That's not a big deal. In fact, a lot of people argue that philosophy is one of the most gregarious disciplines, because in order to benefit your writing or get a good book, you want to hear people that adamantly disagree with you, just to make sure you hold up to criticisms before you publish. Yes. So it's very gregarious. I'm sure other disciplines are that way, but yeah, it's not a big deal that he's giving his own view despite there not being established facts. Okay, so another thing that he's a kind of neo-Fregean, right? I don't want to say that he's a logicist, which is, we'll talk about that later, but Frege's project was to reduce math to logic. That's what basically logicism is, right? He's inspired by Frege, but I don't think he does quite that. Okay, so as you can see, where I've highlighted is that it does figure into a lot of his writing, a lot of his thought. Okay, one thing that we want to understand about the author here is that he is pushing back against this idea that mathematical objects are just kind of made up, right? He thinks that they're discoverable. Okay, so if you look at the bottom of page of the introduction, I'll quote him: "Just as geographers discover continents and oceans, so mathematicians explore numbers and sets. The two kinds of object are equally, quote unquote, real and are described by equally objective truths." So there are, in some sense to him, that there are these mathematical objects. He doesn't want to say that they're completely fictitious, which is a view that he's going to talk about much later in the book, right? People should understand the distinction between discover and invent. So someone like Linnebo is going to think that Sir Isaac Newton, Leibniz, Descartes, these are famous mathematicians, that they discovered what they've contributed. They didn't invent them. Now, there are a lot of people that think that they invented them, right? So just to give a background on the author, he thinks that these are discoverable things ultimately. So just for lack of a better word, it is a bias, but it's a healthy bias. The fact that he's very open about it in the introduction is very common in a philosophy book, and we should expect to see that kind of I don't want to say bias, but that generates some kind of expectation in the text. And it is true that I think right now 40% of philosophers are Platonist. Right now, that's about abstract objects, not just math.
Yeah,
but typically, mathematics is sometimes regarded as a completely abstract, and if you think that they're like these there's this distinguished category from, let's say, psychological facts and physical facts, and you might think those are the same thing, in which case distinguished from the physical, then you're a kind of Platonist, right? Now he's going to talk about what there's like Plato and what he thought in his works, and then there's like the kind of Platonism, which is technically a Neoplatonism, not exactly. Right now in philosophy, if someone identifies as a Platonist, that's not espousing all of Plato's work with respect to math, right? It's just a general term for, look, there's this other realm of abstracta, right? And I'll mention that again. But okay, so and that brings us to this second paragraph here, or first one of this page, is that I wrote a note here. I'm going to see if I'm right about it. But he looks like he wants to resist this like full blown Fregean Platonic realm where the number 3 exists just in a way where like a rock exists, right? He doesn't want to go all the way into Platonism, and I did do some research. Linnebo is not it does not identify as a Platonist. I think he identifies as a structuralist or an abstractive. I think it holds to abstractivism, but I don't know a lot about that. But that's from what I understand, that's differentiated from Platonism. So he's not a full-blown Platonist either. So he, on one hand, he wants to say these things are discovered, but not to the extent where we have to embrace Platonism.
You said that the author holds to sort of an abstractionist
I think it's
position?
technically structuralism, but they're
Okay.
variants of structuralism. And now there is, for anybody that's interested in structuralism as applied to philosophy of mathematics, there is an SEP, or Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, rendition understanding of it. So you can look that up. But I don't know a lot about it, and hopefully we'll learn more as we read. But if you're so excited, as to find out, that's the resource I would recommend, just to get a quick synopsis. So now there's something in the second paragraph that we must, I think, understand that brings us to a very unique distinction in philosophy, right? Ontology and epistemology. Now, this applies to everything, right? What is a thing? What are math? What are numbers? What is their nature? What is their kind of being? How do they exist? This is all ontology, okay?
Mm-hmm.
Whereas the epistemological question is, how do we know them, right? How is it that we come to know them? So take a very famous philosopher, one of the most famous philosophers in the 20th century, Quine, okay? Quine was a kind of Platonist, but he was an empiricist, right? He thought that knowledge was ultimately derivative of experience. So ultimately for him, to know the number 9, right, was to come to knowledge through experience of it, okay? But ontologically speaking, he was a Platonist, right? So there's Quine. His ontology is that, yeah, these abstract objects exist in a Platonic realm or something like that. But how we come to know them is via experience.
Mm-hmm.
So those are two different questions. How do we know mathematical propositions? And what are mathematical propositions and objects?
Yes.
Two different questions, okay? And that's what I think that the reason why I mentioned that is I just briefly saw mathematical knowledge, and I wanted to distinguish that these are two different questions, okay? So now I was wondering what anyone's view on this part of the highlighted red, but this is my interpretation, and I'm open to correction, right? As Speed said and Leo said, we all have, if you're a mathematician, you might focus on set theory, linear algebra, geometry. I don't know. There's all these subdisciplines in mathematics. Now, I think that what he's saying here is something like this, that as we get to different forms of mathematics or different practices of math, right, the way that we understand it might change in terms of our epistemology, right? And that just making commitments about math might apply to one domain, but not apply to the other. So I think that's a really rough interpretation. So if anybody had a different interpretation of that, highlighted in red, but that's the point. I guess in summary, like how we approach set theory is very different than how we approach algebra or geometry, perhaps. And so maybe our philosophy of math might kind of change with respect to what kind of domain of math that we're in. Hence the word pluralist. I think this is where the word pluralist comes from. And the fact that it might actually be foundational. So, like, look, this is our philosophy of algebra, which geometry might rely on, which this might rely on. So it's gradually that's my interpretation. I don't know if anyone has. So the benefit I think that I see in this approach is that let's just pretend there's a problem with set theory. We don't want to say that there's suddenly a problem for the whole entire mathematical discipline, right? Yeah. And that's I think the understanding. Continue. Okay, so another thing that I wanted to stress is that Frege once again is huge here, right? You went from Plato, who talked a little bit about math, and actually, really, really has a big impact on philosophy of math today, and then basically silence for a couple millennia, right? Silence until Frege came along and then revolutionized the whole thing, brought up the topic. Frege is basically the father of like analytic philosophy as it is today, inspired a lot of what happened in the 20th century. in the earlier 20th century. Big character, okay? And so as we continue today, we're going to talk a little bit about Plato, and then there's nothing, right? Up maybe until Kant. Maybe Kant had some considerations about what math was, but Leibniz and Descartes, although they were mathematicians, didn't revolutionize philosophy of math in the way that Frege did, right?
Mm-hmm.
Although they contributed to the discipline of math, they didn't contribute that much to the philosophy of math, right? Whereas Frege did. And they, remember, I don't know, Frege died in 1925, so that's the time period. Of course, Kant was before that. Leibniz and Descartes were before Kant. And Hume, actually wrote on, there's Hume's principle. I don't know, Leo, if you're familiar with Hume's principle. I can't regurgitate it. But, there was, people dabbled, but Frege was the big one in terms of turning everything upside down or revitalizing. So that's one thing that we want to I wanted to bring up. You've never seen, or we've probably never seen, a perfect circle, right? Or a perfect 8-sided what's an octagon, right? We've never seen that, right? But yet we have a concept of it. So there's so Plato's solution is that it must be therefore innate. But we're going to talk about it later. Okay. Let's move on to you see, this is chapter 1. We talk about problematic Platonism, right? A lot of people wish to avoid Platonism. There are a lot of, especially now, I come from a philosophy of religion background, so I'm quite familiar. There are a lot of Christian philosophers that want to avoid Platonism because it postulates a realm outside of the mental and the physical, and if God is mental, then there's some realm outside of God, and
despite Christianity literally being influenced by Platonism, but sure, ignore your history.
No, it's true that the metaphysics has been, but I'm saying in terms of the forms, right? The form of good, like Plato's, for instance, moral philosophy had to do with the form of good. So something is right or moral if and only if your action conforms to the form of good in this other realm, right? So it's actually, while
in other words, piety.
Right. The metaphysics really there are a lot of things about Plato that did inspire a lot of Christianity. But with respect to, I'm just giving the reason why it's called problematic Platonism is that this seems to be a problem for everyone, right? It's not just the Christians have a tough time dealing with it. They resort to nominalism, divine conceptualism, absolute creationism as a way to avoid Platonism, and naturalists and atheists alike, right? Not, this is we want to naturalize everything. That's the tendency of a lot of experimental philosophy and philosophy. That's the tendency of a society to naturalize things, and so it's still something to respond to, is what I'm trying to say, right? So that's why he labels it problematic Platonism, right? It's always been something, and then there are the people that just kind of accept it. But so one of the things that this chapter introduces is one of the most important concepts to philosophy, in my opinion. And because I use it all the time when I do philosophy or when I write papers, and I know that anybody else that is mildly interested in philosophical literature or methodology is the word a priori. Okay, so there are going to be a few distinctions in this book that we're going to probably need, right? Two are really big. The third one, not so. Well, actually, 3. So there's going to be 3. 3, definitely. Okay. So the distinction between a priori and a posteriori. Okay. The distinction between analytic and synthetic, and also the distinguish necessary and contingent. Now, these are all highly technical terms in philosophy that every professional philosopher is familiar with, right? Now, believe it or not, there are people, of course, that reject this distinctions, right? So he's about to give a distinction between a priori and a posteriori, right? Now, whether you accept the distinction or not, that's immaterial to the amount of usage in the domain of philosophy, right? So let's just get to it. Okay, a priori, a posteriori have to do with epistemology. Okay, they have to do with how you come to know things, right? So a priori knowledge is knowledge that you've gotten to by reason or pure reason or something like that. Whereas a posteriori has to do with knowledge that's gotten from experience. Okay. Now, there is something to note here. Many people here have heard of empiricism and rationalism, right? You can be an empiricist and accept a priori reasoning, and you can be a rationalist and accept a posteriori reasoning. What empiricism and rationalism are doing is where does it all ultimately come from? Where does it start with? I guess, right? So the rationalist is going to say, well, knowledge starts with pure reason, right? Empiricists are generally going to say that knowledge starts with experience. Okay, so just because you're an empiricist doesn't mean that there's no a priori reasoning, right? It's just that a priori knowledge doesn't start. Knowledge doesn't come from a priori reasoning. Okay, so we're not going to talk about empiricism and rationalism. That's immaterial. I just wanted to put that as a side note, that if you identify as one of these things, you can still accept the distinction. Okay, now, so 2 examples, and then we'll move on. So a priori, an example is, Trump has been president for 4 years. Well, if you understand that, you can also understand the separate, distinct proposition or truth that he's been president for at least 1 year. Okay? So Trump has been president for 4 years, might be known via experience, right? You have to go into the world, you have to investigate the world in order to come to that knowledge. You can't just sit there if you didn't know Trump was president. You can't just sit there and reason to whether he was president or not, let alone how long he's been president, right? You can't reason to that. You have to actually do some kind of investigation, okay? So that's a posteriori knowledge. So knowing that Trump has been president or has been president for 4 years, or was president for 4 years, that's a posteriori, right? Now, if someone said, is it true that he's been president for at least 1 year? Well, given that he's been president for 4 years, you'll know that he's been president for at least 1 year. That's a priori reasoning, right? That if you already started with the proposition, right, that Trump has been president for 4 years, you can derive from reason, using logic and whatever reasoning, to that he's been president for at least 1 year. Okay. Now, so that's the distinction, and it's an important distinction. And generally speaking, a lot of philosophers accept that math is all a priori. Philosophy is a priori, right? And so math, like philosophy, well, we can actually reason or use axioms or mathematical truths to get to other mathematical truths. So a priori reasoning is a big deal for math, right?
Yes, it is.
I will say that I think it's 12% of philosophers, for some goddamn reason, reject a priori reasoning. I think that number is starting to grow. I don't know what motivates that, okay? But I will have you know that it kind of shows you that there's no established facts here in philosophy. To reject a priori reasoning doesn't establish you an ignoramus or an idiot, right? So, but for our purposes, we're going to use the distinction. The distinction is going to be healthy here. And the author, Linnebo, clearly accepts a priori reasoning, okay? Anybody want to add anything?
Nope.
Okay.
I would be one of those that reject a priori reasoning as the source.
So you would be an irrational. Oh, sorry, you'd be an empiricist, right? Some kind of empiricist.
Some brand, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they're different. Of course, they're different modes. So now let's get into abstract. Okay. Now, the term. So I'm just going to tell you the terms and the way the philosophers use. Right. Obviously, in other domains, these are not how the terms are used. I understand that if we're having a discussion, we can be clear about our terms and then try to communicate with the established terms, whether you use mine or anyone else's, right? So, broadly speaking, there are 2 things and 2 categories of objects in philosophy. Of course, you might reject one as existing, but I'm just telling you the word. I'm just telling you the meanings of the words. Okay, concrete things, which are things that engage in causal relations, and then whether you think that everything is material and immaterial, that's a subcategory of concrete things. Okay, typically, but then there are also immaterial things that don't engage in causal relations, and we call those abstract. Okay, so the number, if someone is dead on the floor, we might think of all sorts of things that would have caused it, but the last thing we think of is the number 9. Oh, it was the number 9 that killed Bob. That doesn't make any sense. The number 9 doesn't do anything, right? It doesn't cause, it's not an effect to anything, nor is it a cause to anything. Okay, that abstract objects don't engage in causal relations, whereas concrete things engage in causal relations. Something like a book can engage in causal relations. Something like myself can engage in causal relations. So I'm going to be a concrete thing. Okay, the material immaterial thing. Well, just understand that typically abstrata are considered immaterial. Now, there are alternate definitions of abstract things, and I'll give some examples of why I personally have problems with defining it this way. But the way that the author defines abstract is what I've highlighted and read. Third, the knowledge is concerned with objects that are not located in space or time and that don't participate in causal relationships. So the latter is what I described. The former, to me, there's a question mark there. And
where it says not located in space or time?
Space or time.
Yeah, I would kind of have some issues with that as well.
Yeah, and it's not just me. There are a lot of philosophers that well, I'll give you one example, and that we've talked about on Speed Stream. I know there's a lot of disagreement. The point is not to flesh out those disagreements, but I will say that there is a school of thought that equators, longitude, latitude, centers of mass, that these things are abstract. So what does the equator look like? Well, we kind of, whatever your metaphysics is either that it's we talk about it, right? There is either it's fictional but if it exists, let's just pretend it exists, that the equator exists, that it's not fictional, then it would exist abstractly. The equator doesn't kill people, right? It doesn't do things. It's causally inert as well, right? Now there might be some contentious stuff in terms of whether it was caused, right? But it doesn't cause anything, and it's something that forgive me with the language here, that hasn't always existed, right? The equator of the Earth hasn't always been there. So there's some proposition at one time index where there is no equator, and then there's another point on the timeline where there is an equator, and it's located. That's the weird thing too. It's an abstract object that's located. Well, we can point it out on a globe, right?
Yeah.
Same with longitude and latitude. Same with the center of mass, right? So that's why I typically don't like to define abstracta in terms of not being in space or time, because there's a location to an equator, there's a location to a center of mass, and there are points in which time affects it, right? But I don't think, but based on what the little I know about the book, I don't think it's gonna matter. Okay, but I think that most everyone, of the large consensus that abstracta doesn't cause anything, not the effect of anything with respect to numbers and stuff, right?
No.
So just as a side note, did anybody want to say anything?
Yeah, two things, Danny. First of all, we have exactly the same highlights on this page. Interesting.
Nice.
The second thing is, are you going to flesh out analytic and synthetic, or
is that in this chapter? Because if it is not,
well, it's not really, but
okay, we can go ahead. Do you want to go necessary and contingent? I think is next on the list.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay. Yeah.
But if you, I've read it, but it was a week ago because I thought we were doing this a week ago. But I'm looking. If I scroll down, I don't think they bring in the analytic and synthetic yet.
Okay.
But but just very briefly, analytic synthetic distinction has to do with, it's a kind of semantic thing going on, right? In the analytic is true by definition, whereas a synthetic truth is true because of some other fact, other than the fact that there's something about the words, right? So typical example is something like a bachelor is an unmarried man. Well, that's true by definition. Okay. Now I understand this is synthetic definitions are a little bit a synthetic statement's a little bit hard to describe, but this is how I would think of it, right? Synthetic means to make, obviously, right? We know that. If you can construct a world, synthesize a scenario where those two things are true, or where the statement is true, and you can also synthesize a hypothetical where it's not true. So here's a good example: Superman is Clark Kent. Well, the world of DC, the DC universe, was synthesized in a way where the man that is Clark Kent and the man that is Superman are the same referent. They're the same thing. Okay? But whoever created the DC universe could have made a world in which Clark Kent and Superman were two different entities, right? So so the idea of a synthetic statement is that it depends on the world that we're in terms of establishing the truth of it.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. That's what it is very briefly. This kind of goes back to metaphysics and philosophy as not having established facts. Well, what's really ironic, I don't know if it's irony, but is that math is one of the things that we cling on to for certainty, right? Like it's like Wittgenstein was one of the reasons. Oh, was it? No, I can't remember if it was Russell or Wittgenstein. You have to forgive me, but when they were, I think it was Russell. When Russell was a child or a student, right? He loved mathematics because he could say this is certainly true, absolutely true, incontrovertibly true. Is that a word? I don't know, but he loved it, right? It's rock solid, okay? And later on, Russell is dismayed that all of the math that he was learning was depending on Euclidean principles, right? That, oh, what happens if we throw out these principles? Well, then what I'm holding on to is nothing anymore, right? Without those axioms in the Euclidean plane and whatever, right? So, but given that was just a side story. The point is that regardless, it's still something that people really like to cling on to as an example of rock solid, something that's absolutely true and certain. Okay, now that's the author points out that this is like the opposite of metaphysics and philosophy in general, right? A lot of metaphysics, what is there? Is it all physical? Is it all mental? Is it both? Right? How can we talk about the world if all we have is representation? Wait, are these representations just the world? Blah, blah, blah. It's just like, it's all like mind numbing and like, what do I hold on to? It's overwhelming, right? But math we can hold on to in some kind of like, it's just a solid and successful manner. He's solid and successful science, as he uses the word science here to mean like something we can know, right? But anyways, it's still, but nonetheless, it's actually philosophically puzzling, according to the author, right? Mathematics is philosophically puzzling, but rock solid. So our philosophy of math is puzzling, but the math is not so much, right? Mathematicians don't give a damn about what the philosophers are doing with it, right? They might be aware of like Platonism and what all that. They don't care, right? They're fine without it, right? They do their physicists, scientists, mathematicians do math, and they don't have to even think about all the philosophical applications, right? Psychology might have a little bit more problems, right? And maybe other kinds of disciplines, right? But I don't know if you're aware, but right now, the way the philosophical landscape right now, psychology and philosophy are starting to there's a marriage now, right? That a lot of philosophers of mind are talking to psychologists, and there's like a happy union at the moment, right? But that just shows you that if philosophy's got its finger stuck in it, then that's grimy. We don't want that. But the mathematicians are like, we don't need you. We don't need logicism and formalism and abstractism and structuralism. We don't need any of that. We're doing math just fine. It's rock solid. I think this is the idea, right? That while the philosophers are tearing their brains out with the confusion of what a mathematical truth reduces to, or whether it is reducible to anything else, mathematicians just don't care. Most of them just whatever, He talks about this notion of in medias res, right? This is presupposing that math is rock solid. Linnebo is not a skeptic about mathematical truths, right? He said so. The point is that like he gave an example with respect to beliefs and perception, right? No one here, and no psychologist, no neurologist or philosopher, we rarely, except for the extreme skeptics, right, are doubting that our sense perception is somewhat reliable most of the time, right? But we still want to know why. What is it that what's our justification? What's the explanation for why they're reliable? So, in the same way, we know math is reliable. That's not what he's disputing. He's not a skeptic, right? Math is great, okay? It's reliable, no problem. We don't have a problem against you, math, but we still are doing an investigation of how do we understand it, right? Why is it? We want to understand the nature of it. So that's not as to doubt or be skeptical about mathematical truths, right? Let's see. Okay, let's talk about Plato's account. Okay, so yeah, basically the idea is that Plato doesn't think we can ever experience or perceive a perfect triangle, circle, or any of these polygons, mathematical objects. After all, even there's probably some minuscule imperfections to even, I'm not like a computer expert, but you would even if it seems like a perfect square in terms of your screen, it's not technically, right? Things are in constant motion, and it's going, it's just anyway. the point is that he doesn't. There's some kind of plausibility to this, right? That we've never seen a perfect polygon or circle. So where we have a concept of it, though, right? So there is a real question about how we come to the knowledge of these such things, if it's the case that we've never seen it. Now, I don't have an answer for that, right? And that's one of the things I want to understand in the book. Quine, being the empiricist, right? Well, I'm looking to him as one of the most famous empiricists, and to maybe provide an answer, right? How is it that you could come up with these things from experience, right? Necessary and contingent are modal notions. So we have a priori, a posteriori, that's epistemological notions, epistemological distinction. We have analytic synthetic with semantic, right? And then we have necessary and contingent. This is modal, okay, which has to do with what can or cannot be the case, possibly be the case, impossible, right? That talking about how things could have been, you're talking about modal. Now, we want to distinguish two kinds of modality here. One kind we're not going to be interested in at all. It's called deontic modality, right? So I'm a teacher, right? And I tell I'm like, you can't eat in my classroom, right? Well, obviously they could, right? But what can't is expressing there is a kind of norm. You shouldn't, right? It's against the rules. That kind of modality is often used in colloquial language, and it is somewhat looked at in philosophy, but we're not talking about that kind of modality, right? A lot of people conflate the two, right? Oh, you can't do that. Well, I can't, right? They're equivocating. They're talking past each other about what they mean by can't. So we're only talking about a specific kind of modality. And with respect to, there are three kinds of modal domains, or four modal domains, right? Three of which I think are going to be most likely irrelevant, okay? Let's talk about the relevant one. Logical possibility, okay? So something that's possible in the logical sense has to do whether it conforms to logical axioms or logical truths. There in philosophy of logic, there are lots of these, but there are three generally accepted ones, and one of which you might not see in certain intuitionistic logics, which we'll get to in a second. But the main two that we would want to look at, so the main two is the law of identity and the law of non-contradiction. So A is the law of identity. A is not A is the law of not. A cannot be not A at the same time in the same sense or way. That's the law of non-contradiction. If these two laws are violated in some kind of sense, we have a problem on our hands. We call it impossible, right? Why is it that a triangle, to say a triangle has no sides, why is that impossible? Well, because a triangle is defined analytically, definitionally, as a shape with sides, right? So it's a contradiction to say that a shape with sides has no sides, right? That violates the second law that I went. The third one is the sometimes they call it bivalence, or the law of excluded middle. This is going to be every proposition, every P is either going to be true or false, or P or it's either going to be P or not P, is what I should say, right? So Leo's either a lion or he's not a lion, right? It's not. There's no in betweenness, right? Now this one has extreme relevance in philosophy of math, and it sticks out. There's a whole broad of thinking called intuitionistic logic, or intuitionist about mathematics, right? And they reject this one. Okay, they accept the law of identity, they accept the law of non-contradiction, but they get rid of the bivalence and the law of excluded middle, as well as proof by contradiction. Why they do that, we'll talk about that later.
You said there were four modal domains, and and the first one was logical.
Yes, logical. I haven't mentioned the other three.
Can you list them for me?
Yes. Okay.
If you don't, I'll never let it go.
Yeah, the three one. The next most used kind of modal domain or modal type is modal. You might hear modal type or scope too, in the literature, is physical possibility, right? So I can't throw a ball onto the surface of the moon, right? Why? Well, it's logically impossible. There's no contradiction, right?
You mean logically possible?
Sorry, did I say impossible?
Yeah,
I meant possible. Yeah, it's logically possible, right? There's no
Yeah.
contradiction. but it's
Yeah,
physically
physically.
impossible because given some model or law or theory, right? Whatever, right? So
Okay, yeah, you don't have to elaborate too much. Just list them or
yeah,
whatever.
okay. Metaphysical possibility and epistemic possibility.
Okay, thank you.
Do you want very briefly, one of the most controversial? It has to do with other laws other than physical laws and not logical laws that govern or constrain the world. Usually, laws of existence. Very common example is Kripke and Putnam's idea of water being essentially H2O. This is a kind of metaphysical possibility. Now, you will hear in the literature logical possibility and metaphysical possibility being used interchangeably, so it gets confusing sometimes, right?
Okay.
But so just keep that in mind, okay? But typically, metaphysical possibility relates to existence. If not, then it relates to logical possibility. Okay.
Thank you. My OCD is happy now.
And
And
then
then-
the last one, epistemic possibility, has to do. Think of coherentism, right? That something is epistemically possible if it doesn't, if it doesn't conflict with your background knowledge or background beliefs. So I may not know if I could survive I don't know. Physically speaking, I may not know if I could survive a fall from my second bedroom window, right? Second floor window, right? But it might be, it's epistemically possible. I don't know if it's physically possible whether I can survive it. I don't know. This is a poor example, but the point is that there's nothing in my background knowledge that would commit me to thinking that it's impossible or that it doesn't conflict. Usually, we're not talking about physical possibility. We're talking about abstracta, right? We're not talking about metaphysical possibility. He's not going to, right? And we're definitely not going to talk about epistemic possibility. One side note: the word plausible usually relates to epistemic possibility. If that's plausible, it seems like it doesn't conflict with your background beliefs. It could be true, right? Think of it that kind of tied in. Plausibility and epistemic possibility go hand in hand. Okay, so that brings us to necessary and contingent. I'm sorry, necessary and contingent. Okay, so necessarily true. So now we're not talking about those other three. We're only talking about logical possibility. So according to us, the logic people or people that employ logical possibility, something that's necessary, right, is something that's true in every case, every possible world. So you can understand it counterfactually, right? They mention counterfactuals. Basically, like counterfactual is a kind of conditional where you're expressing some falsehood in some other, something that's false in this world and making it true in some other world. So, like, if there were 4 people in the stream, there 4 people could potentially talk or something like that. Okay, that's a counterfactual because there are actually 3. Okay, but anyways, you can think of necessary truth as that in every counterfactual and every other case other than the actual world, right, is still going to be true. Okay, so something like mathematics is typically taken to be necessary truths. In every case, 2 + 2 = 4.
Yep.
In every case, the square root of 9 is 3. Right. So that's what necessary means. Right. There's not going to and there are different ways of producing a necessary truth, but we're not going to get into that. Okay, so then the opposite of necessary is going to be in a contradiction. So necessary, so the opposite of something that's necessary is not contingent. The negation of a necessary truth is called a contradiction, right? So a bachelor is unmarried. If that's necessary, if let's say that's necessary, or a bachelor is an unmarried man, if we negate it, then it's not true in any world, right?
Yeah.
Because if you take something that's true in every world, negate it, then it's going to be false in every world, right?
Yeah.
And we call that a contradiction.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, then there's the contingent, which in colloquially it means depends on, and that's more or less. But we don't want to say that in philosophy because there's I'll explain why. Contingent means it could have been false or could have been true. So if it was false, it could have been true. If it was true, it could have been false. So the truth that there are 3 people in this call, that's a contingently true because it could have been the case that there were 4, right? And then it would have been false, right? The reason why we don't want to say there's a dependency relation is that there's idea of bruteness with respect to certain truth. So let's say take the laws of nature, okay, for instance. These are usually taken to be contingent truths, but they don't depend on anything, right? They don't rely on some other thing, right? If they relied on another law, then that law would rely on something. You get an infinite regress of natural laws, and you don't want that. So at some point they stop, right? Maybe a theist might want to say, well, God sustains natural laws, but let's take that concern out, okay? They would be brutally contingent, meaning that there's no, it doesn't depend on anything. There's no explanation for why there's that kind of uniformity in nature. But it could have been another world, where Rick and Morty world, right? There could have been different brutally contingent truths about the natural world. Does that make sense? So we don't want to say contingent does not mean depend on so much as could have been true, could have been false, right?
Would the word nomenological apply there or not?
So nomenological the problem with nomenological with respect to, okay, let me so usually those are no. So yes and no, depends on who you are.
Okay.
Some people think that there are metaphysical necessities, right? And so they're going to say they're nomenological laws that are necessarily truth. And so but I'm not one that accepts that. So the reason why we want to distinguish nomenological laws and physical laws, because all physical laws are nomenological, right?
Yeah.
But in the literature, not everyone takes nomenological laws to be physical.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
so that's
I
part
agree
of the
with
problem. They want like some people think that Leibniz's law is a nomenological truth, not a law that's not logical, right? It's not like a law of identity, law of non-contradiction, but it's true in every world, so it's necessary. And Leibniz's law, to me, just ends up cashing out what identity is, but it's basically what's true on one side of the equation is true on the other, right? All the properties, if A is identical to B, all the properties of A are shared also by B, right? That's basically Leibniz's law, also called the law of indiscernibles. Yeah, I think the law of indiscernibles of identicals or something like that. I just say Leibniz's law, easy to remember. But I don't think that's nomenological. I think that's just another way of saying I think A is A, right? But some people think that there's some kind of necessary nomenological law that's distinct from logical truths. Okay, so here's another problem. This is one of the reasons why he titled this the Platonist problem. Here's the issue, and I'll give you my personal view. I think this is a real issue. Now, some people don't, but I just for if you want to know my background stuff, I think this is an issue. So you might see a little bit of passion, but so I just throw away these examples for a second. Let's take this example, okay? Leo is male. Okay, sorry for assuming your gender. Okay, Leo is male. Leo is male. Well, if you understand, and I wrote referential theory. If you understand a referential theory of truth as referential theory of meaning as helping you establish the truth of a sentence or a proposition, that's going to be true because there's something that there's a Leo, right, and there's the quality of being male, and that's exemplified in Leo, and so that's to say there's a state of affair in which Leo is male, and that corresponds to the sentence or the proposition that Leo is male, and it's what makes it true. So the idea is that on a correspondence or referential theory of truth, right, that there's some kind of relation between the actual thing that is Leo and him being male and the proposition that Leo is male that makes it true. Now, if there was no Leo, so let's take the present king of France is bald. This is a very famous example. Well, a lot of people are going to say that's nonsense or false, right? Because there's no king of France. France lost its monarchy during the Enlightenment age, or French Revolution, right? Around the Enlightenment. So it's nonsense. It's not. Most people don't think that's true, okay? Because there's nothing in the world that kind of establishes that, I guess, all right? If we say it's true that 11 is prime, then there's a question about, okay, if we accept something like the referential theory of meaning or a referential theory or some kind of correspondence theory, right? Well, that means there must be something in the world that's 11 that's exemplifying primeness, right? So that is, I think, a problem. Now, I don't think he gets into it on this page. One solution is just rejecting the referential theory, right? Okay, that which establishes the truth of a sentence doesn't have to do with what's in the world. Sherlock Holmes is a detective, is true, and I don't think there's a Sherlock Holmes, right? Harry Potter has a scar, right? That's true. Well, I don't need to. These things don't need to be in the world, and that's a kind of fictionalism, which is what much later in the book. Okay, so that's one way we can do it, is we can talk about truth and falsity and just completely disregard this idea of correspondence or reference, a referent being necessary to establish the truth of a proposition. Okay, he wants to reject that they have spatio-temporal location. It seems like I'm highlighting this. So this paragraph. So we're moving on from this problem to the claim that, well, these mathematical objects are not abstract. I think that now I want someone that I don't think anyone. I'm not well read to a point where I'm so comfortable in saying this. So I'm going to say it now, and then I'm going to look it up later to confirm it. But I think that John Stuart Mill thought that mathematical objects were empirical. They empirically exist. I have to confirm that. But I know there's someone out there, whether it be Locke or Mill, I don't remember, that think that they're not abstract in the sense that they exist independently from the physical world or the empirical world or whatever, right? And so those views are out there, right? So, but he's right that Linnebo, generally speaking, everyone accepts him as abstract. Frege I read half of his book. I didn't read the last half. But in the first chapter is the most interesting chapter to me because it deals with the metaphysics, a lot of what we're talking about. He, I think, utterly dismantles the Mill, or I think it's Mill, on this point that mathematical objects exist in like some kind of empirical manner. I think I can't put the argument I can't put that together very fast, but it's gonna be something like this. We have concepts of infinity, right? I've never, I mean, where do I go and find infinity to get a concept of it? Or in the same way that take all the numbers of, take all the number of particles in the universe, whatever that may be, I'm going to be able to think of that number plus one, right? I think those were some of the concerns, right? So when it comes to infinities well, I don't think by the way, I don't mean to suggest that infinity is a number, okay? But it's a mathematical concept, right?
Mhm.
What I say? What was the other example? Oh, like yeah, large numbers, right? Well, it doesn't seem like we could gather these concepts from like looking at a rock, right? I don't see. I mean, do I see a number? Well, you see one rock, Mill says, so you get the concept of one from that. But then you can just get a large number, and then you still have a concept of it without having to rely on seeing anything, right? So that's a crude rendition of what Frege might have said. So if you're more interested in that, it's actually a very short chapter, first few sections of Frege's book, The Foundations of Arithmetic. I already talked about that Platonism, in the sense that Plato's views should be distinguished from little case p Platonism, right? If someone identifies as a Platonist, they're not endorsing Plato, not necessarily. Okay, so we have to be careful about that. I highlighted this, and reality, right? So this is one of the problems for me in philosophy, is understanding real existence and actual is of existence, like there is something. So a lot of philosophers think that like there's different kinds of existences. Let me share you my favorite argument for the existence of God. Okay, this is it. God is a fictional character. Fictional characters exist in some kind of way, but not in our actual world, right? So God exists, but he's not actual, or something like something like that. It's silly in the sense that you could say God exists, but he's not actual, right? He doesn't have the same kind of existence, right? Sherlock Holmes exists, but not Harry Potter exists, but they're not actual. But we have to. I don't think that he's being that horrible here. So, but it's good to note that reality, the way he's talking about a view there, that's why he says are at least as real as ordinary objects, right? So there might be a sense in which these mathematical objects and exist, but maybe not in the same way like a physical object exists or I exist, right? So there's equivocation on existence, so just be wary of that.
Diving too deep into stuff, it's going to be sort of like just establishing some basics, something like that in the introduction. Let me go back up.
I might have missed that, but I mean, if we get to Frege, then that's deep stuff to me, but maybe not to y'all. Let me.
Do they discuss the number 1?
So we will discuss Frege's number, right? And but it's not going to, they're going to we have to differentiate again with all the sets. We have to go over. And Leo, I would hope that you do lead us on this, but we have to go over the rational, irrational, natural numbers, right? All of this stuff must be explained because it all pertains to these various projects. Because what might be a problem or something true of the natural numbers may not be true of the set of irrational numbers, and that might have implications philosophically. I don't know. We'll find out.